FTP, or functional threshold power, is a key metric in cycling, all right, especially when you're talking about one's ability to hold a certain power number for about an hour. So in this video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to break down what FTP is, why it's essential, and how to test it properly. If you've not already, please subscribe and turn on those notifications. All of my videos pertain to some aspect of cycling, racing, workouts, and so on.
Jeans love tears, but I won't cry. Tonight I'm alone, but I'm gonna be alright. I'm gonna be alright.
So what exactly is threshold power? Functional threshold power is quite simply just a measure of fitness. So FTP represents the power, measured in watts, that you can theoretically maintain for anywhere from 45 minutes to an hour. So really what's taking place in regards to like the muscles in your body, riding at your FTP pushes you right up to the limit, like where you're pushing harder, and it drastically starts to limit the duration of what you can ride. So in other words, if you can raise your threshold or raise the power output that you can sustain for an hour, then you can ride harder, longer. If your threshold is not trained that high, but rather it's relatively low, well then you have to stick to that type of power output duration. Otherwise, if you go above your threshold, then you can only hold that for a certain amount of time, and that's why we understand what our threshold actually is. So the other thing is with threshold, once you understand where that is, you can also stay just below that, and you can sustain that for a really long time. So if you stay just below the tipping point of your threshold, you can actually hold that for multiple hours if trained effectively. For me personally, I actually experienced this year in a race. I was able to hold close to my threshold for almost an hour and a half, and then I started to back it down just a little bit, continue out the 4-hour road race, but I rode like within about 10% of my threshold for the entire race. And it's only because I knew where my threshold baseline actually was, and I knew if I went over that too much, I was gonna burn out quickly, and I needed to be able to do an effort to sustain for 4 hours. So I was able to ride just below that tipping point and hang on to that for 4 hours. And I'll tell you, it was not easy, it hurt so bad, but because knowing my threshold, it allowed me to do that. So now, this is why threshold is huge, because when you understand threshold, now you understand what type of efforts you can put out in race. You understand the physiological cost that it's having on your body by going above or below it or staying right at it. So thresholds really help you too to set up your training zones. So if you're going out for an endurance ride, well, you can't do an endurance ride unless you really know what your threshold is, because then if you're gonna ride at endurance, that's anywhere from about 55 to 65% of what your threshold is. So it's important to get that baseline of threshold or functional threshold power before you start to set your zones. And that's why testing is super important in order to figure this out. Now for most people, threshold, finding that metric out and figuring out what it is actually does set all of your zones correctly. I have realized in the coaching world that with some athletes, they might have a really high threshold or they might have a really low threshold, but that doesn't really mean that their anaerobic or even their VO2 max zones are gonna be correct. It really does depend on the athlete, but to be honest, for most people, when you figure out your zones based off of your functional threshold power, it pretty much works across the spectrum. There's maybe like 5% of the athletes out there that this doesn't really work for, and that's totally okay. That's why I think personalized coaching is a really good approach, because the coaches like myself will actually dive in and understand, you know, what a proper zone is for someone when it comes to VO2 or anaerobic stuff. But anything below threshold, everyone's zones are pretty much identical. Everyone has the same endurance, everyone has the same tempo, everyone has the same recovery. Your threshold zone itself is the same. But again, this is why knowing functional threshold is good, and it does give you a relatively good ballpark on where to start. But with coaching, you can even go even more in depth and even tweak it even more personally to yourself when it comes to training zones. But if you can't afford a coach and all you got is a power meter and a Garmin or a Wahoo, hey, you're totally fine. You're gonna be set with figuring out these zones, and you can mess around with the numbers and tweak them yourself and see what really works for you. So let's dive into testing protocols. I know there's a million different ways to do a threshold test. There's things from the ramp test to 2 by 8 minute max efforts with some rest in between, to even just a standard 20-minute all-out test and see where you lie. Like there's different types of tests, and honestly the first one I'm gonna roll out is the most popular one. It's gonna be a 20-minute test. So what you do with a 20-minute test is you jump on your bike, you warm up really well, and then you go out 20 minutes all out. So you hold a pace that's pretty hard for 10 minutes, and then what you do is you really try to hang on for the next 5, so then you're at the 15-minute mark, and then from 15 to 20, you are just going all out as hard as you can, just hang on to the very end. When you finish this 20-minute test, it should be theoretically one of your best 20-minute powers ever, and then what you do then is you take that and you multiply it by 95%, and that gives you your threshold. So say I test out about 360 watts for 20 minutes. If I multiply that by 95%, that's gonna give me a threshold of 342 watts. Sounds pretty cool, right? But here's the problem with this. A lot of people do this test right and wrong at the same time. They will give everything they have in the 20-minute test, which is fantastic. That's what you're supposed to do. But the one key metric they forget to do is they forget to do a 2 to 5 minute max effort before they jump into the 20-minute test. Now here's why I say this, because we have this thing called anaerobic capacity. And when you're going above threshold, you start to use your anaerobic capacity to stay there. And if you have the anaerobic capacity tank completely full, it's gonna skew your results. So technically I had done a threshold test earlier in the year, and actually it was a workout, but I did 20 minutes completely fresh. I did 20 minutes at 360 watts, and it gave me a threshold of 342 watts based off of that 95%. Now in reality, that was not actually my threshold. It was super close, but it was not. When I did some testing with Inside Testing, which is a company not indoors, but anyways, when I did some testing with them, my hour threshold came out to about 335. I know, still, we're talking like just a few watts here and there, right? But still, that's the difference, okay? There's a difference there. Now, what you wanna do with this 20-minute test is you wanna warm up well, and then you wanna go out and do anywhere from 2 to 5 minutes around your 5-minute power. You just wanna go, empty a little bit of that anaerobic tank down, and then you do a recovery period of anywhere from 15 to 20 minutes. Make sure you hydrate really well, make sure you take some gels, whatever you gotta do, and then you go out and you do your 20-minute test. And I guarantee the test is gonna be slightly lower, but the end result will actually produce a better threshold metric, and then you're not gonna be overestimating on any of your workouts. So again, that is the formula for the basic 20-minute power test. So the second testing protocol that I have tried once or twice, and I have had some athletes try it, that does work. You know, it's a little bit different, but it's gonna be a 35-minute to 45 minutes worth of testing. I know, you're like, hold the phone, how is that better than a 20-minute all-out test? I do believe that it's gonna be a little bit mentally easier, and what we're doing here is with this test, you kind of have an idea. If you think you've gotten stronger, you can kind of estimate what your threshold is. So say I'm riding and my threshold was 325 at the time, but I've been noticing I've been able to do like 335 relatively well, right? So what I'm gonna do is for this test, I'm gonna take a target threshold of what I think I can do, and I'm gonna plug that into this test. So I'm gonna take 335, and after a good warm up, okay, we're not gonna do any anaerobic stuff before, this is just gonna be a pure test. So we're gonna do a good warm up of at least 30 minutes. You wanna get the engine nice and warm and going, because this is a long period of testing. After 30 minutes, you're gonna do 10 minutes at about 92 to 95% of your target threshold. So if I have a threshold of 325 and I'm planning to, you know, hopefully target around 335, I would like my threshold to be around that. I'm gonna base this test off of the 335 number. So I'm gonna take 92 to 95% of 335, which actually comes out to something around 308 to 318, okay? That's the metric. So I'll do the first 10 minutes at 92 to 95%. So for me, it would be around 308 to 318. And then once you finish those 10 minutes, you jump straight into 15 minutes of at your target threshold. So again, our target threshold for this sake is 335. So then I'm gonna do 15 minutes at 335. And once you finish that 15 minutes, Then you're going to jump into another 10-minute section where you will start to slowly ramp up the power. Okay, as you start to get through that, you're going to ramp it up. Now the cool thing is you want to try to go from anywhere to 10 to 15 minutes. So again, the structure of the test is going to be this: 10 minutes at 92 to 95% of your target threshold, and then you're going to move into 15 minutes of your target threshold, and then you're going to move into 10 to 15 minutes, depending on how long you can go, of a power that's either at or above your target threshold. Ideally, you want to try to build through those last 10 minutes, and when you get to those 10 minutes, you should feel exhausted, and then you want to just keep hanging on as long as possible and try to get to that 15. If you get to about 12 minutes and you have to quit, then you quit. But you want to try to get to there, all right? Now this is how the test works. We're not multiplying by any percentage to figure out what your threshold is. Rather, what we were doing is we were taking that 10 minutes, that 15 minutes, and that other 10 to 15, and we're smushing it all together, and we're going to take the overall average of the test. You will find that the overall average of this test will actually be what your threshold is. Because again, it's a 35 to 45 minute test. So those 10 minutes of kind of sweet spot with the 15 minutes of targeted threshold, followed by another 10 minutes of hopefully above threshold, that's going to give you an average power of what your actual threshold is. Now again, this is a different type of test, but now you don't have to worry about that anaerobic ability getting in the way. This test, you're waiting till the very end to use that anaerobic ability, and to be honest, you've probably actually already used it in the beginning parts of this test. So when you get to the end, you're purely doing an aerobic effort, and you're really pushing your body through, and you're really trying to see where your body stops buffering that blood lactate. So then you start to figure out where the threshold is, the ceiling is, of what you can sustain for an hour. Again, this is a test I've done like once or twice. I had some of my athletes do it. It's an interesting test. It does work rather well. I mean, I know the Training Peaks guys, they really swear by this new testing protocol, but that's one way to try it. There you have it. That's what threshold is, why it's super important and essential to cycling, and how we can test for it. Please leave comments below. I'd love to hear if you went out and tried this, what happened, how it went. If you have your own way of testing threshold, or maybe even have like a specific window of like how many weeks you wait till you test it, I'd love to hear about that too down below, because I mean, this is a community. A lot of people learn from each other, so please leave comments down below. And that's all. That's it. Hey, I'm super glad you guys took the time to watch this. As always, I'll see you guys later.